So John doesn't know what I'm about to ask him. I have a question. I was talking to our friend Austin Burke about this the other day.
I'm so nervous. I don't know where this is going. Go
Let
ahead.
me let me ease your nervousness in one sentence. Is there a point in doing the fancy stuff with the training? Now, with the fancy stuff, I'm talking about RFD work, power works, speed strength, plyos, max isometrics, eccentric overloads. Is there a point in doing that? Now, for background, I gave you some of the background already when we were walking up here. I said I just finished a max isometric cycle.
Okay, yeah.
PF flared up. Last year it flared up. Then I was looking at my history of doing the more fancy style of training. I don't even know if fancy is the right word. I would say like specific, like the more specific stuff according to research. And there's about there's like a 20% of the time I end up jumping higher, and I've actually jumped my highest ever. At the end of those 20%, 80% of the time I usually end up getting hurt. And then the not fancy stuff, which is essentially volume and intensity, I would say, usually end up jumping higher. And then I was talking to Austin about it, and it's essentially the same thing for him. Now, my theory for it is not even a theory. My observation is the stuff does work, but we're dunk addicts, right?
Yeah.
We jump. I think we jump too much for that stuff to work.
So there's a couple things that come to mind. One immediately that comes to mind, and that is as you increase your training age and your specificity, as you increase your training age and how elite you are, your specificity should go up. And for us, dunking or jumping is the specific thing. So for example, if I'm a long jumper, an elite long jumper, if I'm an elite sprinter, then my general work needs to get more general because my specific work is getting more specific. In turn, I'm jumping higher, I'm jumping more, I'm jumping at a greater output. So you can't afford to have a lot of other specific weight room work or specific plyos or other activities because the risk goes up. So I think that that's one major consideration that with you, I mean, it's interesting because when I think about like Greg Rutherford, for example, you know, Greg's a 27-foot long jumper, gold medalist in 2008 or 12, gold medalist in 2012, silver medalist or bronze medalist in 2016. I think he was a world champion at some point. Consistently jumped on any given day like 830, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of differences between what he did in training and what you do in training, and there's also a lot of differences in the type of athlete that he is. So when you're looking at these training laws and you're kind of, you know, trying to make decisions, one of them is that you go from general to specific, not only within a current year, but from like an athletic career point of view. So Greg was at the end of his career, I think he was probably in his 30s, and was long jumping, you know, 820, 830. I think that his actual weight room work was pretty much the same all year. He never really got away from doing step-ups, you know, or doing, you know, some power cleans, never really squatted, never did calf raises, maybe did some rehabilitative work, and then sprinted and long jumped throughout the year. That's pretty much what Greg's program was.
And was there a coach?
That was Dan Paff that was like working with him and like orienting him towards that. Now, Greg had done different types of programs in the past, but he credits Dan in being the one to kind of parse down the things that weren't actually helping or doing anything and really prioritizing the stuff that was making an actual difference.
Was their goal to make him better, or was it more to just maintain performance and health?
I think Dan would say that there wasn't much left in the tank to make him better. Like Dan probably would have made the argument that none of that stuff is going to make a difference. It's not going to move the needle more than just going out, staying healthy, and long jumping. And that was like Dan's big thing is simplicity. You know, you can't, it was more like the stuff you're doing is probably going to hurt him in terms of his performance. Like this stuff isn't actually going to move the needle. It's just going to discombobulate his nervous system. Like if you were to do heavy squatting or heavy power cleans or heavy lifting, like he would just be like, or, you know, a lot of plyos and stuff like that. He would just be like, I don't think this is going to move the needle at all. If anything, it's probably going to make his performance worse. And that's like a big part of it was don't make them worse. Yeah. Like, you know, most of the stuff makes people worse. And I think for Dan, that was like a big argument is you have to keep, if you're not competing, there's no point. And then if you're not competing, well, there's also no point, right? Like if you're just going to suck because you're trying to do all this other stuff, you're failing in his eyes.
Yeah.
And I agree. So, I think there's multiple considerations when I'm looking back towards you, because you could take the same approach. If you wanted to err on the side of high reward, low risk, and just jump 50 forever, or 51 forever, or 50.5, you could probably do that. And you would have decent, returns. It's also a different event, right? Like jumping off 2 feet is, again, it's more like shot put. We've talked about that numerous times. And so I think that if your goal is to move the needle and you really want to be a better athlete, you have to, or at least it makes sense to do a lot of the fancy stuff or complex stuff. Yeah. Specifically doing max isometrics, doing what is happening over here with these dogs? It makes sense to do a lot of that stuff. So I think that if you're going to try to improve, you should look at the evidence, see what it's indicating, test those things, and see if you're noticing corresponding changes in performance.
Yeah.
When it comes to Austin, it's a completely different case. There's so many different things I could get into with that I just won't. But specifically with you, I think that, like, I don't think Austin oftentimes, I don't know specifically with him what's going on where he can train hard and not get hurt in any condition. Yeah. I don't care if you're doing volume and intensity. I don't care if you're doing isometrics. I don't care if you're doing eccentrics. Like, he'll get hurt doing anything hard, like anything that is pushing intensity. He almost is more like Greg, where it's like, okay, fine, I'll just do the same things, you know what I mean, over and over and over again. Yeah. So, I don't necessarily think that it's a fair assumption or estimate. The other thing is Austin gets in his head about things. So if you don't train him and he has a bad day, or he's not getting worse, but he's not his best ever, then he's not happy. And then if you're doing the things to try to make him his best ever, he's not happy, because the likelihood you're going to jump your best is low, no matter what. Yeah. And you'll be content with a 46. Austin will not be content jumping 42. Unless he's, even if he's on a low rim, he's not going to be happy. So I think that kind of convolutes the results. When you're talking about, like, for you specifically, I think that, one, the evidence is pretty clear about tendon adaptation and the nervous system and things of that nature, right? And you are at a point in your career where you could mail it in if you wanted. You absolutely can mail it in, do super simple stuff, and do that, whatever, across the year. A lot of the time, sometimes that is what we do. And it's almost guaranteed to have you jumping, like, fairly high. Yeah. I think when we start to experiment with this other stuff, like, you tend to be very overzealous, and I'll ask you, do you think that you can do X, Y, or Z thing? And you'll tell me initially yes. But then we get through the first 2 weeks of the cycle, and then, you jump when you're not supposed to, or you do something that you're not supposed to, and then it goes the other direction. So I think that for you, it's worth it for 2 months of the year to do an isometric focus, but to do it in a way that you don't get hurt and can still jump. I think that's the bigger consideration, because there's not a world that exists where you're not going to be dunking each week. And if you're a track and field athlete, you probably don't understand that. If you're a person that likes to dunk regularly, then you probably do understand it. Like Donovan, Ben, even one of my athletes, Nick Rossi. I don't have that fix that I need. I enjoy training.
You should tell them how Ben and Nick Rossi reacted to.
So I told them, they were arguing with me that a lot of people, Mark Mueller, that they were basically like, oh, well, why don't you just stop dunking so much throughout the year and do more plyos and do more of this stuff? And I'm like, because he can't. And they're like, what do you mean he can't? And I'm like, he physically, emotionally can't do that. He won't. He will plan to do that, but he will not successfully achieve what he set out to achieve. It will not happen. So he has, dunk or die. He has no self-control. You could be like, hey, Isaiah, you need to not do this thing. And he's going to be like, okay, got it. And then Thursday night is going to roll around, and he's going to start thinking about dunking. And then Friday morning starts, and he's like, hey, John, can we go dunk? And then I'm like, well, how do you feel? And inevitably, Isaiah's going to say, great. Regardless if he feels good or not. He's going to lie. And then he's going to go dunk. And that's going to derail the plan.
Remember on, what day was this? Was this Saturday? I was texting the chat, and I was like, I feel so good.
Yeah,
I feel like I
yeah.
could dunk today. Bro, I trained that day.
It was so
Horrible.
bad, yeah.
Like my knee was sore. Like I could barely, like my outputs weren't that crazy. I
He's
was
a
like,
fraud. The real exposing Isaiah Rivera
Yeah.
is that he has the inability to control his need to dunk. And the thing is, I've even punished him or gotten on him or yelled at him for dunking when he's not supposed to or during the session. And it's like, I've talked about it before, but it's like he's gonna punch me in the face. And I'm like, this isn't worth it. Like, I'm gonna like risk my friendship to like achieve this goal as a coach. Like, it's just not, I'm not getting punched in the face because I told him to stop. It's not worth it.
it's a tough battle. What you said earlier about I could mail it in, technically.
You could, yeah.
I'd be
You just
good.
mail it in, you'd be fine.
That's a recurring thought, especially when I'm like suffering a lot. Or like
Emotionally?
like no, I'm saying like the workouts.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
extreme workouts, or I'm dealing with like a small injury or something like that, and I'm just like, there's nothing else to prove here. Like I feel like I could mail it in.
But dude, I talk to people, like I was talking to Travis Slade about it, and I can't remember who else. They were asking me about another athlete, and they're like, I think what takes him to that next level is like maybe he's not as talented as X, Y, or Z, but his training is just so robust. And I think if you were to mail it in, I think it would be just that. It would be exactly that, a cop-out. Two, I think that it decreases the likelihood that you set such insane record that no one can touch it. And then the other thing is, I think you would start being less content with your performance knowing that there's more on the table. There's more on the table. And you're like, I don't think you would be content mailing it in.
And inevitably, guess what would happen? Like let's say today I was just like, I'm done. Like I'm retiring like from training. Not pro dunker aside, like take that completely out of the equation, but like training hard. Like I'm just gonna go play basketball a couple times a week.
I don't think you'd be happy.
And no, you know what would end up happening is enough time would pass where I would feel pretty good, and then I would just go and have a dunk session or something.
Okay.
Or I'd get really bored and my training I'd go try to max my squat out. Like my nature is
to push.
Yeah. Like I don't think I can't. Like
you don't have it in you to mail it in.
Yeah.
Within yourself to mail it in.
I think it's gonna be a slow decline. It's gonna be like LeBron, year 22. It's gonna be like LeBron, year 28. Imagine him trying to still like play. Like I think it's gonna, or Jordan on the Wizards. It's gonna be more of a Isaiah. You should stop now. Like you're barely rim grazing. You're barely rim grazing.
And you're gonna be.
I'm gonna be 55, and I'm gonna still.
You're gonna be like, I'm going in and doing super maximal eccentrics. No, I think you'll get to a point where there will be diminishing returns, and you have diminishing returns now. But I mean, if the question is, what do I think will push the needle forward? It's not just going back between volume and intensity. Like you can only do that for so long before it's gonna get stale, and maybe it works for 2 months, maybe it works for 4 months, but even then and I made this argument, I don't think that it works in the long term. It can't. You can't just go back and forth and see. I think we're sitting in this exact spot the last time we had this conversation. Like, I don't think there's a world where that exists or is like productive for you. Otherwise, like I've made this argument many times, otherwise everyone would have insane verticals. I think that as an elite guy, if you want to be more elite, you've got to be willing to try doing things that are more intense. They are inherently more intense or are allowing for structural adaptations.
Do you think that you can sustain a vertical by doing that? Like if I were to go volume intensity, and then
I think
with the caveat of you can still build in variety, I think, through exercise selection.
So you're saying you would, I mean, I think it would still get stale. I mean, that's the other piece. So are you going to intensify by exercise selection and following a progression? Because in that point, you're still following a progression. You know what I mean? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, are you still going to change exercise selection? Because exercise selection changes intensity inherently. If I do a clean pull, a leg extension versus a fucking deep squat, deep squat, then the deep squat's more intense. So you are following or if I go really heavy half squats, that's also following a progression. Like you can't, your argument is like, oh, I'm gonna just do volume intensity, but then it's like you're not really doing volume intensity. You're still following general specific. You're just cutting out things that you don't necessarily want to do. You know what I mean?
So when people say
Like
it's
I guess
essentially
like you have to
just
define what you mean by the nuanced stuff. Like
yeah,
is it just
yeah,
specifically isometrics and eccentrics? Because I think there's an argument where maybe you do that, or maybe you do, maybe you don't. It just depends on the risk,
yeah.
like cost benefit analysis of it.
I guess there's two ways of defining it. There's my way of defining it, not my way of defining it. How I would do it is essentially you're working on high volume, max strength, absolute strength, going between all of those, uh, varying the volume and intensity, varying the exercises that you do, and building variety in that way. And I think you could make an argument that you could improve. I don't think maybe hit your genetic. I think it would be the difference between me going 51 versus 52 or 52.5.
I think you would go the other direction.
You think it would,
I think it would be hard for you to get back to 50.5. Like, I think it would be like, oh, I think retroactively when you're thinking about it, yes. But who knows until we were to look at it. But in terms of what the evidence would kind of indicate is like, you're going to hit diminishing returns, dude. And not only that, you're going to hit like training monotony. You're going to hit training monotony. You're going to go the other direction probably. I mean, you can't get, how are you going to, it's like the plyometric argument. There's no overload. There's no inherent overload. The force is, you're basically doing a concentric only program at that point, right?
Yeah.
So how are you going to increase your tendon stiffness? How are you going to do that? You're only going to get that, once every 4 months, maybe?
Yeah.
And then how are you going to increase your rate of force? How are you going to increase maybe you increase your cross-sectional area, but like it's going to be hard to find activities that are novel enough to get your nervous system to increase motor recruitment, right? Like you're just doing the same thing throughout the year. Maybe, I mean, even then you probably could change like your cross-sectional area, maybe, but even that's going to get like to a point of diminishing returns. And I think it's going to be very difficult. What are you going to do? 100 sets of 10 instead of 10? Like,
do you think having dunking in the mix changes anything though?
Like if you want to dunk every week versus don't?
Yeah, because I think that's true. I think that would happen if you weren't dunking frequently. I think by having dunking in there once a week,
I think you're at the point
I think you would at least sustain though. I think you could sustain. Like if you talk about me, I think I would sustain 49 to 51 for a pretty long time. I think.
Yeah, for a pretty long time. But I think eventually it would.
Yeah.
I mean, it's either going to stagnate or go the other direction. I don't because I mean, how
you
are
think
you
just to
supposed to
maintain
improve?
you have to almost improve? Like to maintain a 50.5, you have to.
Let me ask you this in terms of business. If I were to ask you that same
Oh,
question,
if
what would
you're
you
not
say?
growing, you're dying.
Yeah, if you're not growing, you're dying. Like I really think that's the
Yeah.
case, and I've seen that with myself. Like my goal has been quote unquote to maintain since basically struggling with amenities since I moved to Florida, and I'm going the other direction. Why? Because that's just the nature of it. Like you will go the other direction if you're only trying to maintain.
And there's father time.
Yeah,
That's
you're
also
gonna
playing a
you're gonna get
role
older.
into
So
it.
I mean, really, this comes down to a risk reward benefit of given activities, right? So if I'm doing super maximal eccentrics or isometrics, the risk is you're going to get PFP. The reward is you could move the needle. And it's not that we don't do volume intensity or have these changes in variety or specificity. It's just that added option, or maybe we do plyos or whatever throughout the year. Like, it's just that added variety, that added specificity, I think increases your longitudinal growth and increases your ceiling, your athletic ceiling. I think when you just go volume intensity, it's like maybe the slope is like this or flat, really flat, but slowly upwards by doing all this other stuff. And maybe there's more dips and troughs and valleys, where the other one is just flat line.
Yeah.
And then it's just like troughs and, whatever, troughs and peaks within there, valleys and peaks. But yeah, I think that you're doing yourself a disservice. That's really how I view it. If someone were to train like that, I'd be like, you're never going to reach your genetic potential. Yeah. Versus like athletes that are willing to do that. I mean, I'm sure you could list a handful of people that do exactly what you just said.
I literally have people
in your mind that you're not going to name that haven't improved. And you could be like, oh, I wonder why. And it's like, because you're not willing to push the envelope. You're not willing to leave stones unturned. You're not willing to say what's strong enough, what's intense enough? What's the hardest thing I can do? Oh, I'm just willing to be content doing, the status quo. And then like, you can do that, but you're not going to be Isaiah Rivera. You're going to be someone else. Yeah. You're going to be XYZ.
You know what it comes down to is having the discipline to not push when you might get hurt.
Yeah. You need to understand that it's written in pencil for a reason. That you are going to go in with a plan and it's written in pencil that could change.
Yeah.
But the intention of that cycle is to achieve X, Y, or Z physiological goal, right? It's to increase motor recruitment. It's to increase rate of force development, isometrically or concentrically or whatever, or eccentrically. It's to increase tendon stiffness or joint stiffness. It's to improve connective tissue or change the structures. And the big argument when it comes to like, on the track side of things is the intramuscular coordination, meaning, yeah, maybe you got better at this RFD exercise on a force plate, but you're running slower. Why? Why are you running slower? And it's like, well, you're just discoordinated now because you're fatigued, right?
Yeah.
And you can't be fatigued when you're doing something that sensitive. Whereas with vertical jump, you've got time on your side in terms of the ground. Even 1 foot dunking off, a power jumping approach. You've got to be more careful with that progression, you know what I mean, and things of that nature. But I don't think there's a world where you train less hard, train less intelligently, train less specifically, less complex, and you get better longer term in scenario A versus scenario B.
I think the reason why you might see that in track is because in track there's win or lose, you compete or not compete. We're in an interesting position where we can afford to be really risky.
Oh yeah.
Because there's no competition I have to be at.
Yep. And I think even if you do, it doesn't matter. Like there's no real consequences where those guys, it's like, oh, well, maybe I won't get in this meet or this meet or this meet. And the other thing too is track's just more sensitive. Like it's a way more sensitive metric. You talk to sprinters and it's a lot less predictable. Like boost Xnator is going to lift 4 months of the year for heavy stuff. And then it's all ballistic the rest of the year. And that kind of makes sense, right? But if you did that with a dunker or like a 2 foot jumper or volleyball player, they're not going to jump very high. Because they need more motor.
I think that stuff works in track too, though, because you're getting more freaks. Like,
oh yeah, well it's like
bro, I'm thinking like I was looking at Donovan and I was talking to him about this. I was like, I think he's the best dunker in the world, in my opinion. And then I gave him.
He's better than you right now.
So no, this is the analogy I gave him, or not analogy. This is how I explained it to him, because I think part of being the best is
genetic ability.
How consistent are you? And then I was like, if you had. We dunk once a week, so you have 52 dunk sessions of the year. And how I explained it to him, I was like, I think 50 or 40 of those dunk sessions, you're going to outdunk me. But 12 sessions of those years, out of that year,
I'm going to shit on you.
I'm going to be like, I'm going to have like crazy outlier days.
Right. Like
I think the reason that is because of his genetics. I think he could literally do nothing and dunk twice a week or 3 times a week and maintain like a 47 inch vertical. And I think that's what you see in track. I think the reason you see these training styles that they're not really pushing themselves very hard.
Because they're so gifted.
Is because they're gifted as hell.
Ride out talent.
All they need to do is stay in shape and sprint consistently, and they're gonna be running sub 10.
Yeah.
And in dunking, that's not as frequent because you don't have as big of a pool of people. So there's less genetic outliers. But if all of a sudden, how many people sprint in the world?
Oh, track's one of the most, racing a foot race is like one of the number one competed in athletic endeavors.
Let's say it's 1 billion. Or let's say it's half a bit, 500 million people.
Just for the sake of this analogy.
Imagine if there was 500 million people trying to dunk, trying to jump higher. How many freaks would come out of that? That would only have to do jump squats.
Well, I think it's I think the other thing too is maximal jumping outside of volleyball is not like a common thing that you're maximal 2 foot jumping is not, even if, because you get a lot of basketball players, like everyone that plays basketball probably tries to dunk at some point.
Yeah.
Male basketball players. So it's like, well, why don't we see more freaks out of that? There probably are that many people that do technically try, but they're not, like, basketball is not dunking.
I don't even count that because basketball's so fatiguing. Imagine now all the basketball players, if you had them stop playing basketball and have dunk sessions.
Well, that's my point. That's my point.
Like John Morant all of a sudden wasn't fatigued from basketball.
Yeah, but that's my point is like basketball is not dunking per se. So it's like imagine if they had a dedicated session once a week even.
Yeah.
Right? If every basketball player did that. That doesn't even happen. That doesn't even happen. That's not a thing in high school or college basketball. So I think that would move the needle towards more freaks like being out there and not having to train at all. I mean, we see it all the time. Like there are guys out there that I can think of off the top of my head that don't do jack shit in the weight room or on the track or plyos or anything. Or very low load and fly. And it's like, well, how's that possible? It's like they just do the skill once a week, just like track and field athletes. Yep. You just go out, do the skill once a week or 2-3 times a week, and you're going to get faster. Sometimes twice a week because you're so gifted that if you're tired at all, you just don't want to run fast. And it's like, well, are you really getting faster or are you just like kind of using what you already, like, are you just fresher and you got to like, you're just getting better at the thing that your body was innately built to do better than everyone else. Like it's
it's like you have your
genetic ceiling is way
it's like
easier.
your performance window, and they're really just here versus what we're trying to do is
move the window
move
up.
the whole window up.
Exactly. It's like inside of your genetic abilities is maybe quite easy, and I think that's like the art of track and field and what makes it challenging and why no one definitively has like figured it out. Where I think 2-foot jumping, we pretty well figured it out. I don't think that there's like much out there where I'm like, wow, that's really like, that's crazy. I don't think there's, in terms of training, there's only so much you can do. You know what I mean? We're kind of limited by what we have access to in terms of sports science. I mean, maybe if we go to Mars or like something like that, we'll find some new evidence or whatever, or like maybe there's some, EMS stuff that you could do potentially. But, I think track is less definitive. I think that it's less predictable. It's less. The training laws don't always work in track and field. Fatigue plays a bigger role. You're going to see bigger decrements, and that's part of the reason why I fell in love with it because I was like, well, I can dunk the shit out of a basketball, but I struggle with high jump. Why is that happening? And that always fascinated me. And that question I think motivates other people in track and field too, like even a 100-meter dash coach. The other thing too is I think drugs are riddled in the sport, which makes it really hard to say definitively
what works.
What works and what doesn't work because there's just like, it's people are cheating.
I also feel like the training laws do work. It's just like we were talking about earlier. There isn't it's too risky to experiment with pushing too hard
with sprinters.
With a lot of sprinters.
We could talk about this at length another podcast. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this. But in short, I think that your ceiling, I think your progression would go like this and just flatten off.
Yeah,
versus I think it would slowly creep forward if you do the fancy stuff.
It's like the fancy stuff works. The fancy stuff is riskier.
100%.
That's what it really comes down to.
It is a risk cost-benefit analysis. Discipline. Yep. That is, congratulations. You graduated. That was a terrible handshake. There you go. All right. Well, thank you guys for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this. This was definitely more of a conversation between us, which I don't know. Maybe you guys enjoy that or whatever, but we used to have these conversations all the time. We weren't necessarily directing it towards you guys. Sometimes we have these and we just like shoot the shit and try to problem solve. That's what this kind of was. So I hope you guys liked it. Make sure you go to THPStrength.com if you want to coach by the best in the absolute world. And if you want to get your knees better also, we're the best at that. Yeah. And then we also hired a guy. Yeah. We don't even talk about that. But yeah, we're I would say like 80% of our job is managing athletes' injuries from training. Because they go out and jump when they're not supposed to. But thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you tomorrow. Ciao.